Something which is often not paid as much attention as it should be is the actual research method. The whole purpose of a research method is obviously to go and find the answer. But the reason why you describe what method you're going to use is to plan out how you're going to gather the data, or what you're going to do, how you're going to gather the data, how you're going to prove or disprove your hypothesis. It's a plan. It's open to review. Anybody reviewing it should be able to look at that plan, the research method, and say, well, that'll work. With that research question, in this context, with that method, you'll probably get your answer in this amount of time. It's not a guarantee, and usually it's easy to say, well, look, that won't work, or that's inappropriate research method. It's much harder to say that will work, because it's kind of guaranteeing the result, and we can't do that. But the whole point is to set it all out and to check whether that research method is appropriate for the problem concerned. Now, a planned method sets out to avoid some known research biases. That is confirmation bias. This is proving what we already know, or proving what we think to be right is right. That is a confirmation bias, and good research avoids that bias. A hindsight bias. So hindsight bias is we go and do some research, and then we look at it knowing what we now know, and we do our analysis now knowing what we know. No, the research ought to be able to project forward, to say what we expect with our current knowledge, not with the knowledge we have in the future. A measurement bias. Measurements are always a bit of a problem, and the way in which we measure things can give us some biases, particularly if the instrument is insensitive, or will only pick up some symptoms but not others. There are ways of getting a measurement wrong. Sampling bias. This is usually a problem. We have limited access to the entire world's resources or data. We have limited time, and so we have to take a sample of the world. And depending on that sample, this can give us a bias. The most normal one is that a lot of that research is done on students or student-related things because it's convenient, it's handy, it's close. Well, students don't quite represent everybody in the world, so we've got a problem there. We have to be very careful what we conclude from that. And there is procedural bias. That is, the research method itself, the procedures of the research method bias the actual results. So a good research plan tries to remove as many of these biases as possible. It's not always possible to get bias-free research, because sometimes we only find out we actually have a bias after the event. A research method is a plan of what you will do. And like any plan, there are some things it should cover. For example, how much data do you need? This is a problem when people are trying to find something that's got, I don't know, 5 or 6 variables or something of that nature. And what they don't think of it in the first, right at the start of the planning, is they were going to need about 120 separate case studies or separate instances of the data. That's a lot. Sometimes that's just not possible. So you need to consider what type of data is it you're going to get, and how are you going to get it. The data quality. This can be a problem in surveys where people have infinite genius for finding some way of misinterpreting your question. So you get misguided responses or misrecorded data. If you're using other people to gather your data, they don't know what you want to know, and they could write it all down wrong. Corrupted data, if you're getting electronic, it could get corrupted on the way. And biased data. and people just bias the answers. So data quality can be a problem, and your research method ought to address these concerns about data quality. Data security, and now particularly as this university engages more with industry, problems of confidentiality and data security are going to become more important. So your research method ought to address these concerns. So it's company confidentiality and intellectual property. Your research method ought to address these concerns. So it's company confidentiality. Know your research project. You have limited time and limited resources. Know your research project. You have limited time and limited resources. You don't have an infinite budget. You don't have infinite time. You've got a certain amount of time. You've got a certain amount of you don't have an infinite budget. You don't have infinite time. You've got a certain amount of time. You've got a certain amount of research done in that time as possible. So when you're planning your research method, how you research done in that time as possible. So when you're planning your research method, how you methods such as ethnography or action research, because both of those usually take several years. Methods such as ethnography or action research, because both of those usually take several years of time. However, your chosen research method should be appropriate for the problem and provide enough rigor to ensure an acceptable level of validity. This usually means that student research projects aren't, they're not all that, they're not that big, and they don't explore things to a great deal of depth. That's reserved for doctorates and postdoctorates. The time, resources, and data. What we do in the available time to gather as much valid data as possible. You can always gather invalid data, but how are you going to get as much data as you can in the time available? Much valid data as possible. You can always gather invalid data, but it's a plan of what you're going to do. You have to address research bias. It's a plan of what you're going to do. You have to address research bias. You have to address the questions of. You have to address the questions of how are you going to look after data quality and how are you going to look after confidentiality. How are you going to look after data quality and how are you going to look after confidentiality. How are you going to gather as much data as you can